Augustus Wood is a Black Studies scholar on African-American history, political economy and resistance, and he joins us now from Urbana in Illinois. Thanks so much for coming on the program. I want to ask you about these powerful images that we saw yesterday, the images of the National Guard on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. When you see those images and when you hear President Trump talking about sending the military in, what goes through your mind?
Well, thank you for having me. What I see happening, and this is probably worst case scenario, but I see this as a means of Trump trying to possibly declare a state of emergency to postpone the election, that there's an organized strategy of white violence against Black people now, and that Trump is using a lot of this pro-militarized strategy to shore up his weakening base. This is clearly a fight in the trenches. And what it does is it gives me viewpoints of 1992, when the president at the time used the insurrection order of 1807 at that point as well. So again, we have to understand that these are not spontaneous acts, where what happened with George Floyd, what happened with the National Guard being armed and organized by the president. These are all strategic elements of a broad-based plan against Black people to continue to hurt us, especially after the COVID crisis ravaged the Black working class communities. And so that's what I see happening right now, that this is part of a strategic part on Trump's plan to try to win the election and to shore up his base or delay the election and become, as he wants to be, the ruler of land as a fascist dictator.
Interesting points you bring up there, Augustus. I want to talk about the international response. The protests, the calls for justice for George Floyd have gone global. We're about to look at the situation in London, where there is a protest by Black Lives Matter. When you see this international response, what do you make of that?
The first thing I make is that the problems that we face here in the U.S. are a microcosm of the issue of racial oppression across the world. We have to understand that racial oppression, there are three parts to it: political subjugation, economic exploitation, and social humiliation. And all three of these elements can be seen when you look at Black working class people. Low income people of color in these spaces are facing the exact same type of oppression, and it is systemic, meaning it's worldwide, and it's tied directly to global capital. As global capital since the 1970s has increased its power and its networking ability, it has also taken away the conditions, or worsened the conditions of Black working class people who work in service sector or blue collar jobs. And they have decreased the wages. They have increased police violence or repression against those of us who fight back. And so you have this internal struggle, this dialectic of these power bases in these areas where global capital is dominant, against these Black working class people who are saying enough is enough, and we're going to continue to organize and find a way to better our lives and strengthen the lives of all people. That's exactly what's happening right now, is that Black people are under siege, not just in the U.S., but across the world. But the U.S. is the heart of the monster. And so these groups across the world see us as being the bastion of hope and promise. And so they are joining in solidarity. And it's one of the most beautiful sights that we can see. The bigger this thing gets and the more solidarity we have, the better chance we have of winning and changing the system for good.
Okay, and how do you practically change that system for good? I just want to read out a quote from Governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz. He said it's not by putting more of the National Guard on the streets or having a curfew. It is by establishing, looking at the systematic issues that caused it in the first place. So my question is, how practically do you solve what we're seeing globally right now?
Exactly. I believe that you solve the problem to get rid of the symptom and not the reverse, which is what a lot of people are calling for. Practically, you have to talk about organizing for these initiatives, particularly major campaigns that have existed in Black working class communities, like free healthcare, like a jobs program, like health centers, things that are the funding for education. These are things. These are campaigns that are waged in grassroots campaigns locally in Black urban working class spaces, where we need them to turn into full-fledged nationwide and global movements, because these are the things that that these power groups, the white supremacists, the ruling classes of these areas refuse to grant us as people, the things that we need as human beings, the right to free education, the right to free healthcare. These are, the things that will strengthen us as people. But we have to remember the U.S. is an exceptional space in relation to racial oppression, because since slavery, these things had been denied from us. So practically, we're working against 400 years of a ruling class that never saw us as people and that refused to keep us or to acknowledge us as people who deserve these things as human beings. So that's what we're fighting against. So it is a very difficult, practical fight that the Minnesota governor is putting forth. But we have to start locally, and we have to create these types of issues on the ground in our communities, and then we have to fight for them, and then get those types of people into power as mayors, city council people, state representatives, state governors, etc., over time, that will fight for those human needs. And so things like what happened to George Floyd, things like that are happening to what happened with the Flint water crisis, things that happened with Puerto Rico, all of these really nasty human rights crises cannot occur if we stop the problem and we have a radical change in how the structure runs. The two-party structure, removing that, writing a new constitution, and again coming up with a Black agenda for Black working class people, the majority of the people in the U.S. So again, there are practical ways to do this, but there are no short-term practical ways. These are long-term strategies, and we have to organize our people to come up with these strategies and to implement them. So self-determination must be at the forefront of what we do. We determine our future.
Okay, Augustus Wood, it's been a pleasure to speak to you, and I hope to have more time with you another day. Really appreciate how articulate you are on this issue. Really appreciate it. Thank you.